Welcome to Eye on Korea, a video podcast produced by the Korea Economic Institute of America. Join us for in-depth conversations with experts and policymakers as we explore issues in Korea's economic and political relationship with the United States and how these issues may influence South Korea's regional strategies and its global relationships. I'm Scott Snyder, President and CEO of KEI, and today I'm joined by Zack Cooper. Zack Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies U.S. strategy in Asia, including alliance dynamics and U.S.-China competition. He also teaches at Princeton University and serves as chair of the board of the Open Technology Fund. Before joining AEI, Dr. Cooper was the senior fellow for Asian security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He also previously worked as co-director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and as a research fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. He served as assistant to the Deputy National Security Advisor for Combating Terrorism at the National Security Council, and as a special assistant to the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Department of Defense. Welcome, Zack, to Eye on Korea.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be here.
And I'd like to start with the Trump administration's defense policy, especially related to the Indo-Pacific. What do you think that the Trump administration is signaling so far regarding the forthcoming national defense strategy, and what implications do you see for U.S. relationships in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, the National Defense Strategy may be the first, it could be the only strategy document we see out of the Trump administration this year. The Trump administration has not publicly released a version of the interim strategy that they wrote earlier in the year, but I think some of the details have leaked out. And what's been reported is that it has two priority areas. One is homeland defense. So this is a bit of a change from prior administrations. And second is the Indo-Pacific. And I think the big question when it comes to Korea is, what does the Trump administration really mean when they say that they want to prioritize the Indo-Pacific? My guess is that part of what they mean is they want to prioritize China. I don't know where North Korea fits into that rubric. And that, I think, is the challenge for South Korea is South Korea a sort of top priority for the Trump administration, given that they do care a lot about China? Or do they see South Korea as too focused on the peninsula and therefore they put their time and energy into other alliance relationships?
And you were over in South Korea in June, I think, right at the beginning of the new administration. And so I'm sure you heard a lot of buzz related to expectations for how the U.S. is framing its policy. What were your major takeaways from those conversations, and where do you think the potential connections are, and where do you think the potential disconnections are?
I had two big takeaways. We talked about this a little bit. One was that I was impressed at how pragmatic the jae-myung administration was, even in its first few weeks. You know, there'd been a lot of Americans who'd said, oh no, this could be a really difficult relationship right off the bat. And actually, I think jae-myung's team early on, and it's a small team and still getting built out, had a really wise approach, right? Which is, look, the United States is a bit less reliable than it used to be, but that doesn't mean that you have to throw away the U.S. relationship. It may mean that you actually want to have more ties with other powers, both in the region and around the world, to make sure that you can protect Seoul's interests, but you can still invest in the U.S.-South Korea relationship. So I was quite impressed to see that approach. We'll have to see what that looks like in practice now as the months go by and we get a little bit more detail about those policies. But that was the really positive thing. The one negative observation I had, I felt that people in Seoul were way too optimistic about the Trump administration. And what I mean by that is there's almost this expectation that the logic of American policy should drive Seoul and Washington together. And I want that to be true, but I also fear that it might not be. And so I came away from that trip worried that people in South Korea are making logical assumptions. For example, that if the United States wants to be active in Northeast Asia, it needs a good relationship with South Korea. I think that's true. I'm not sure how much some people in the Trump administration believe that. And so there's some flashpoints, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more. Things like the possibility of removing troops from South Korea, pressing by Washington to get Seoul's firm commitments about what it would do in certain Taiwan scenarios or about what the U.S. could do with its forces in South Korea in those scenarios. I think what I heard in Seoul was a lot of confidence that those issues could be managed. I hope that's right, but I'm a bit more pessimistic.
Okay. Well, maybe we can get at that by turning the question around. What have you been hearing from the Trump administration about their expectations for Korea? And in particular, how do you think that those might have evolved now that they knew who they're dealing with?
Well, I think the expectations for Korea, it's a little bit confusing when you hear the Trump administration talk about this. Sometimes, if you listen to the president, the expectations really are just on the trade side, right? It's about this, how many dollars is Korea going to invest in the United States? That is the primary metric. I think if you listen to the security experts within the Trump administration, they're saying some slightly different things. Initially, I heard that they wanted increased defense spending from Korea. Interestingly, I don't think they fully understood that Korea is one of the Asian partners that's doing the most by far in terms of defense spending. So you would have expected Seoul to get some extra credit already for what it's doing on the defense side, but it seemed to get sort of lumped in with Japan and Taiwan and Australia. And the administration is saying, look, everybody needs to spend more. And initially it was a 3 or 3.5% threshold. Now I think we're hearing 5% of GDP is the new 3. My guess is that doesn't mean that South Korea has to spend 5%. It might have to spend 3.5% of GDP on defense and then be able to include other things like infrastructure and cybersecurity, just like the NATO allies have. So that's one item. The second expectation that I've heard from some in the Trump administration is that Seoul makes some pretty specific commitments about what it would do in a Taiwan scenario. And this I find very strange, largely because the U.S. won't make any specific commitments about what Washington would do in a Taiwan scenario. So I think it's hard to expect allies, whether it's in South Korea or Japan or Australia, to provide specific political commitments about what they would do in these scenarios if they don't know exactly what Washington would do. And President Trump is so unpredictable that I don't think you could know what Washington would do. So I think those are the two areas that I've heard the most. And there's two pieces of leverage that I think the Trump administration has threatened to use to get those concessions. One is potentially pulling out forces from South Korea, probably the Stryker Brigade, which would be about 4,500 troops. The other is I think we're seeing a slow weakening of U.S. actions on extended deterrence. And this hasn't been talked a lot about in the public, in part because the jae-myung administration is so new. But I worry that the U.S. is sort of holding back support for some extended deterrence guarantees until it sees what South Korea is willing to put on the table. This is kind of similar to what we did in the NATO context. I think it will undermine confidence in South Korea, but it seems to be one of the strategies that some in the Trump team want to use.
Well, that's very interesting. It's also complicated by the fact that the jae-myung administration looks like it's going a potentially very different direction on North Korea from its predecessor. So I guess what I'd like to dig into a little bit is the transition on both sides and what it means for the relationship, because clearly the Biden administration, under the Biden administration, we saw a lot of growth of institutional connection under the rubric of revitalization of the alliance. And the Yoon administration was obviously very amenable to that. Now we've got this dual transition in management. How jarring do you think that is for the relationship? And how concerned are you about the possibility of erosion of some of the progress that had been made in recent years?
Yeah, I am very worried about that possibility of erosion. And it sort of gets to this underlying tension, which is that For Lee Jae-myung, clearly North Korea is a top priority, maybe the top priority. And for Donald Trump, for his national security team, North Korea is sort of explicitly not high on the list of priorities. China is the top challenge. And so I think each of those teams come at this issue from a very different perspective. Now, obviously, Lee Jae-myung's been pretty pragmatic so far. So maybe when he's in Washington, there's a way that he can sort of sidestep this issue or align pretty closely with Trump's view. But I worry that it's going to be very difficult fundamentally because our interests are just not exactly the same. And not that they've ever been exactly the same, but the Trump team, it really focuses on China as the primary regional challenge. And that, I think, is going to put South Korea to the test, where either South Korean leadership is going to have to echo that same focus. And to some extent, Yoon Suk-yeol was willing to do this with the Biden team. Or there's going to be a risk that Trump and his administration believe that the alignment of interest between Washington and Seoul just isn't that great. And I worry that might pause some of the cooperation we've had or even cause the United States to pull away a little bit.
One of the big issues that I anticipate is going to come up at the summit next Monday is the question of how coordinated we really are in terms of our threat perceptions related to China. And you've mentioned this, but you've also given a mixed picture, I think, about what the Trump administration's actual policy is toward China. And so I'm wondering, if you were sitting in Seoul, what would you be watching and how would you be trying to interpret what the administration might be doing? Another way of asking this is maybe that's the reason why you detected what you consider to be over-optimism. Maybe they're doing it slightly differently from the way you're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. The other reason maybe I'm underly optimistic is as somebody who watched the Trump administration go through this transformation in the first term on China issues, it seems like there's been such a reversal. And I think some of us who've watched Trump really shift and embrace China more are pretty worried about that. And it's just more distant, I think, in Seoul when you're watching some of this happen. My guess is that South Korean leadership is going to have to make a very quick assessment next Monday about what Trump wants to hear. And I think priority number one for him clearly is about South Korean trade investment in the United States. But then does Trump next want to hear about how South Korea is aligned with the U.S. on China? Maybe. If Marco Rubio is in the room or Pete Hegseth, that's probably a good message that they would like to hear. But on the other hand, if President Trump is in a headspace where he's thinking that he really wants to have this positive meeting with Xi Jinping right when he goes to Korea, right, probably right before, right after the APEC summit, maybe he is thinking, look, I really just want a good relationship with China. There's no reason that I need to sort of force South Korea to align against China. So part of what's hard here, I think, is you have to figure out, are you playing to Trump and his personal instincts? Or are you playing to his team? And the last thought I have on this is what makes it so hard right now is in a normal administration, this would be the conversation you had with the American National Security Advisor. There is no national security advisor to have that chat with. Marco Rubio's doing that. He's Secretary of State. He had to cancel his visit to Korea that he had planned. And so he doesn't know this new team very well. And so I think there's just a huge amount of guesswork here. And it has to be incredibly difficult for Seoul to figure out which one of these two messages is going to resonate when they meet Trump directly.
Yeah, well, no doubt that's a source of stress that probably showed up even in terms of trying to schedule the summit. I want to shift to alliance modernization because that's an area where the two governments have actually begun a conversation. And I wonder if you think that can or will come up in the meeting between Trump and Lee Jae-myung, and in what form do you think it might come up?
So I would expect this to be part of the fact sheet that the two governments put out alongside the meeting. But I don't think it's going to be high on the agenda list for discussion with Trump. And my personal view is actually this is probably best done without Trump in the room. Not because Trump is necessarily going to undermine those efforts, but he's just not a deep expert on them. And the White House staff is so limited, it's going to be very hard for them to fully brief him on that sort of issue, especially when what he really wants to talk about is trade. So I think this is one of these discussions that would be better off held for, what used to be a 2+2 meeting, although we'll see if we can get one scheduled, where you have the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense on our side and the ministers, Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry on the Korean side. This would be an ideal place for those detailed alliance discussions. I think having that debate in the Oval Office is a risky thing to do. But the area where I think there's going to be some real pressure from Washington is about what American forces are allowed to do in the event of a China contingency. This has always been a little bit murky, and I think the Trump team wants some pretty firm commitments. That is a fairly legalistic, detailed discussion that I'm guessing even the U.S. officials would rather have without the president in the room. But part of the hard thing is without the architecture that we would usually have between the lower level appointees, it may be that some of that rises to the president's level before it's fully baked.
Okay. Well, stepping back from the summit meeting, I want to ask you about some of the specific issues related to alliance modernization. You've just obliquely referenced strategic flexibility. Where do you think that the two governments might be able to come out on that in the context of a hypothetical cross-straits contingency?
So if I were South Korean, strategic flexibility would be the area that I would be most willing to negotiate. And the reason is if we're actually in a China contingency, the United States is probably going to do whatever it needs to do with its forces to make sure that they're protected. And so whatever agreement we have, I think the president of the United States at that moment is going to sort of mandate that whatever, was written down, that the U.S. is going to do what it needs to do to keep its forces safe. And so I think it's possible that we could end up in a very legalistic discussion on strategic flexibility. I think that would be a mistake. If you're South Korea, what are the areas in which you can give some space to the Trump administration and pocket some easy wins? This seems like one to me that is less costly than other things, right? A more costly thing would be the U.S. withdrawing forces from the Korean Peninsula, for example. And that could be the trade-off that the Trump team puts on the table. They could say, look, either we have more flexibility with our forces or we don't want as many forces in Korea. So given that kind of choice, I would say strategic flexibility is the area to negotiate on. I'm not suggesting that I think this is a great idea by the Trump administration. I gave some comments when I was in Seoul, and I think, there was almost this implication from the way some of them were read out that I thought strategic flexibility was a good idea. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that at the end of the day, Seoul's going to have to negotiate on something. And this is one where the costs are pretty low, I think, to being open to negotiations with the Trump team.
Yeah. Another basket or maybe two of issues that seems to get a lot of attention is the OPCON transfer issue. And of course, this is in the context of a potential reconfiguration of U.S. command relationships in the region. So I don't know if those should be dealt with linked or separately. So I just want to ask you to address both of those in terms of what you're expecting the outcome might be.
Scott, you've lived this for decades. I was in the Pentagon 20 years ago when we were debating OPCON transfer. Some things never die. So I'd say first, on the operational structures, so the U.S. is updating the way that it handles its forces in Northeast Asia. We're now going to have a U.S. forces Japan that looks a lot more like U.S. forces Korea. that actually has operational command and control. That's a big change. There is a group of folks within the Trump administration and within the U.S. government more broadly that have never fully understood why our forces in South Korea are structured the way they are. And obviously, this is incredibly complicated because you not only have U.S. Forces Korea, you also have CMC and the UN command. So it's not like you can easily change any of these structures. But I do think ultimately there's a desire perhaps to have USFK sit in a real way under the Indo-Pacific Command. And, I'll give you an example. When you look at the posture hearings for the U.S. military, usually you've got the U.S. Forces Korea commander sitting next to the Indo-Pacific commander as if they're sort of equal 4-stars. But I think people in the Trump administration rightly are asking, like, why is this the case? This command shouldn't be on its own at the same level. And it's not technically, but the way it's treated in the Pentagon has often been that way. Sort of what happens in Korea stays in Korea. I think there will be a desire from some in the Trump team to reorient and have it be clear that there's U.S. Forces Japan, there's U.S. Forces Korea. They both report up to Indo-PACOM, and to slowly reorient in that way. And I think that will shift how we think about the OPCON issue. I doubt we're going to get away from a conditions-based approach. I think that is so locked in now that it's hard to throw that out. But I wouldn't be surprised if they say they want to review the OPCON plan, just like they've said they want to review the AUKUS arrangement.
Yeah, well, if there's any issue that can outlast OPCON, it's probably the rearrangement of command arrangements in the region. I want to. We're getting to the end of our time. I want to ask you about the credibility of U.S. defense commitments in Korea and how Koreans are seeing them. Since you were there in June, obviously there's a lot of different pressures as related to that. The lens, I think, looks different between Yoon and Lee. But I'm wondering, what you're hearing, or do you think Koreans are expecting? And of course, they're dealing with Trump.
I'm very worried about this, and I look to you and KEI for a lot of what I know about the subject. But when I look at the South Korean debate on extended deterrence, I think we're seeing some flashing red signs, and understandably so. I thought of the Washington Declaration under the Biden administration as a very serious effort to reassure South Koreans that the U.S. was a reliable ally. And I think if we assess that effort, it didn't really work. You didn't see a fundamental change in some of the polling data. It got a little bit better, but the reality was there was nothing the Biden team could do to reassure the South Korean public that Donald Trump wouldn't get elected again and say, look, I don't really care about South Korea. And when you've got President Trump going and saying in the NATO context that if countries don't pay enough, he'll encourage Vladimir Putin to invade them, I think you've got South Korean, public expectations that understandably are going to go down and become more concerned about what Trump might do or some other American president. So I'm very nervous that we are in a weakening situation in terms of extended deterrence confidence in South Korea. I think part of the reason I mentioned this earlier is I think the Trump administration is perfectly happy to allow some in South Korea to be worried because this is leverage that they can use. I think this is terrible alliance management. This is not how you should do extended deterrence. This will have long-standing effects that are very negative for the United States, one of which is more interest in nuclear options on behalf of the South Korean public. But I think that is an entirely natural response. And, as a failed political scientist, I would say if I were sitting in Seoul and I had a China that was doing a massive nuclear buildup, North Korea that was perfecting some of its nuclear and missile programs, Russia using all kinds of nuclear threats, and I saw the U.S. sometimes slowly backing away from its extended deterrence commitments, that would make me panicked. And so I can understand why there's this instinct in Seoul to rethink some of the longstanding principles that it's relied on in terms of the extended deterrence relationship.
So in light of that, as a last question, given that we're having the summit meeting on Monday, the 25th, what is the one thing that you think that jae-myung should prepare to bring with him for his conversation with President Trump?
Well, just to take the easy one off the table first, the investment in the United States, because I think that's what the president cares about. And so that has to be the first, second, and third thing out of his mouth. When Prime Minister Ishiba was here from Japan, this worked well. He said, $1 trillion of investment in the United States. That's what Trump wants. But putting that one aside, I think if jae-myung can demonstrate to Trump that at the end of the day, South Korea is a really valuable ally, that will form the foundation for Trump's views in the future. So the area where I think maybe there's some real opportunity is on the shipbuilding side. The United States is in huge trouble in terms of shipbuilding, both on the commercial side and on the naval side. South Korea has wonderful expertise. It's investing in the United States in this area. And there's some supporters of the president who are really strong backers of South Korean investment in shipbuilding. So I think if you had to focus on one area where you can say to the president, look, obviously there are tensions in all relationships, but this is an area where you need South Korea, and we are here. We're putting money on the table to help the United States as our ally. That's a really easy area to sell.
Okay, so make American shipbuilding great again. Zack, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your insights, and thank you for joining us on Eye on Korea. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like the podcast, subscribe so you won't miss the next one, and leave a review to help others discover the show. Follow the Korea Economic Institute of America on social media, or visit keia.org for more resources, events, and expert analysis on Korea. We'll see you next time on Eye on Korea.